Garfield is a cat that we can all identify with.
I hate Mondays.
Is there anyone in the world stupid enough to actually like Mondays?
And not because we like lasagna, but because it's specially made for us to feel a part of it.
Sleep, eat, sleep, eat, sleep, eat, sleep, sleep, eat, sleep.
And it's that Garfield has a very big story behind it. In fact, this character and franchise have many curiosities, facts, and various events that not many of us know about. That's why today, friends, we're going to be looking at the history and evolution of this orange kitty. Because you probably have no idea who Garfield's original owner was long before John. Jim Davis, a guy who had just graduated from college, went to work with a successful cartoonist, Tom K. Ryan, who had his own very successful comic strip since 1965 named Tumbleweeds, where they made fun of life on the American frontier. Working with this cartoonist served Davis to take inspiration and have the idea to create his own comic strip, which he named Norm Nut, a play on words that translates as Norm the Mosquito. In this first idea, he told the adventures of a group of insects living a daily life. When he finished his comic strip, he sent it to hundreds of newspapers and publishers, but all of them rejected it without exception. Only one editor accompanied the rejection with advice, telling him that his stories were incredible and his jokes were too cool, but that no one could identify with an insect. So Davis, instead of getting upset, took the advice, and he took a look at the most popular newspapers to get an idea of the comic strips that were published in them. That's how he realized that the protagonists of those strips were mainly dogs, but none had added a cat. So he remembered that in his childhood he lived surrounded by many cats and took advantage of this experience by starting to make a few doodles. And from this first experiment is where the character of Garfield was born. This first design of Garfield was completely different from what we know. Since it was a super fat and lazy cat who didn't care about anything else but eating and sleeping. In this strip, Garfield still didn't walk on two legs, he looked like an ordinary pet. Another main difference was that the protagonist was not the fat orange cat, but rather his owner, John Arbuckle, who was introduced as a cartoonist who had a hard time relating to others and only had his pet, named Garfield, as a friend. And this has its explanation behind it, because John would be representing a part of Davis's life, his creator, both being cartoonists and with few social skills. Davis, with the first experience he had, he was now nervous about whether this time they would accept his comic strip. So, surprisingly, on the 19th of June, 1978, Garfield was published in 41 different newspapers, being one of the most popular comic strips. At that time, Davis was still working with Tom Ryan, but after seeing the incredible profits he made with his Garfield strip, he thanked him for his help and continued on his own path. But it was here where one of the first changes to the character emerged. Since after the great coverage this comic strip had, several important people noticed its potential and became completely interested in Davis. One of them was Charles M. Schulz, the creator of Snoopy, who had the good intention of helping Davis. What surprised many was that Charles went directly to Davis's studio to give him the advice that Garfield, instead of walking on 4 legs, should now walk on 2, and that his limbs should look more comical, with his hands and feet being larger. In addition, several of the newspapers where the strip was published told him that instead of the story focusing on John, it should focus more on the cat. And this because Garfield was the funniest part of the story. All these tips helped Davis so that more readers could identify with Garfield, making his comic strips increasingly successful. But of course, not everyone was happy with this cute kitten, as 3 months after such success, one of the most important newspapers that had bet on putting Garfield strips, the Chicago Sun-Times, decided to remove these strips from their newspaper. With this, Davis's entire project was completely affected. But luckily for everyone, thousands of readers decided to send letters and calls with complaints to the newspaper asking for Garfield to return. If it weren't for this, Garfield might not be as well known today. Compared to his first design in 1979, Garfield became more compact and more defined compared to the first design, which many called a monster cat. In addition, he stopped looking with his gooey little eyes. This change, according to Davies, allowed Garfield to push Odie off the table or reach a piece of cake. All of this, just like with the other characters. Surprisingly, it didn't take long for Garfield to make his first appearance on television. As just 2 years after debuting in the newspapers, it became an animation in 1980, appearing on the show The Fantastic Funnies, where various cartoons appeared such as Dennis the Menace and one of the creations of Davis's great friend, Charlie Brown. More and more, Garfield was becoming a complete success, and with his new design, it was taking the shape of the one we all know today. With so much success he was having, Garfield got his first television special, called Here Comes Garfield, where he has to rescue Odie after the pound captured him.
Odie, you're so foolish that you don't even know you're in trouble.
And this kept rising more and more because, surprisingly, in 1985, another Garfield special was released called Garfield in the Town, which won an Emmy Award for Jim Davis. And all this continued until 1987 with the A Garfield Christmas special.
Things, objects, junk, toys, greed, avarice. I love it.
This had great significance for Davis as well as for the viewers. This is because it was rebroadcast every Christmas from 1987 until the year 2000. And this is because Davis wrote the script and described it as an autobiography, as Garfield spends Christmas with family with John and Odie on a farm. This is because Davis grew up on a farm. And a year later, it would be a decade since the premiere of Garfield, right in the year of 1988. Everyone found this whole story very lovely, and the audience kept asking for more and more of Garfield. And it was a few months later, in September of 1988, when the Garfield and Friends show emerged. A show which many of our parents might remember.
Come on in, let the fun begin. Come on in. Garfield extends the invitation.
This show was divided into 2 segments. The first segment was entirely about Garfield and his antics, while the other was about Oz Acris. Another comic strip that Jim Davis was working on at that time, Garfield and His Friends, stayed on television from 1988 until December 10th, 1994. This show, along with the comic strips, made Garfield a global phenomenon, having annual earnings of $750 million to $1 billion in merchandise. With so many licenses and merchandise available, Davis had to found the company Pulse Incorporated, which managed all the thousands of Garfield merchandise. After the Garfield and Friends show ended, the comic strips continued to be published. Everyone wondered if there would be more television shows of this adorable kitten, but to everyone's surprise, a television show is not what they would get. Instead, because right in the year 2004, the live-action movie with Garfield would be released. It
is called Shaking the Tail.
This would have a twist from the first special, in which the kennel takes Odie and Garfield has to rescue him. Here, Garfield has to rescue Odie again from a crazy guy named Happy Chapman already.
Is it your time already, Javi?
With a budget of $50 million, this movie managed to gross $200 million. And the audience kept asking for more. Since no one had gotten bored of Garfield, so just 2 years later we had the Garfield 2 movie. This one wasn't as successful as the first, as with a budget of $60 million, it only grossed $143 million. And 2 years later, they would be presenting us on television the second Garfield program, which oddly first premiered in France and not in the United States, in December of 2008. This program was completely computer animated, as the previous show was hand animated and produced by Davis's own company. Paul's Sync, with a duration of 7 years, as its last broadcast would be on September 24th of 2015. And from what we saw, Garfield did not have a tragic ending like other series or cartoons. His comic strips continue to be read by hundreds of people. By 2018, more than 200 million people were still reading Garfield comic strips. And for this same year, he had an estimated net worth of $800 million. To this day, Jim Davis is not as recognized as his creation, Garfield. But he likes it this way because, if we remember, he doesn't have very good social skills. Apart from the fact that Garfield holds a Guinness record, there are many curiosities that I'm sure you don't know about. So stay tuned for our next video with all these facts and curiosities you didn't know about Garfield. Like, for example, did you know that Garfield is immortal? Really? He can't die?